Near midnight, a particular entry caught his attention. A heated discussion about the Washingtons' request to install basketball hoops 6 months before they ultimately moved away. The board had denied their request, citing concerns about neighborhood, aesthetics, and potential for increased street traffic, despite approving similar recreational equipment for 3 other families on different streets. The difference? The Washingtons were the only black family among the applicants. Marcus leaned back in his chair, rubbing his eyes. This wasn't just about him. This was a pattern, a system of subtle but persistent discrimination masked behind covenant enforcement. He'd seen it before in various forms throughout his life, at his prestigious university where security repeatedly asked to see his ID, in high-end stores where associates followed him but ignored his white friends, in job interviews where he was questioned about his credentials despite his impressive resume. His phone buzzed with a text message from James. "Heard about the security visit. Diane's on a roll. You okay?" Marcus replied. "Fine. Just adding it to my documentation. This is getting interesting." James's response came quickly. "Monthly HOA meeting is Tuesday. Might be worth attending to get a feel for how the board operates." Marcus considered this, then typed, "I'll be there. Thanks for the heads up." He closed his laptop and prepared for bed, mentally reviewing his strategy. He wouldn't let Diane Keller drive him from his home, but neither would he stoop to petty retaliation. His approach would be methodical, evidence-based, and ultimately effective, the same principles he applied to software development and, before that, to his legal studies. As he drifted towards sleep, Marcus recalled something his grandfather, a civil rights activist in the 1960s, had told him: "When they try to provoke you to anger, respond with such calm competence that they question their own sanity." Tuesday would be interesting indeed. The Oakwood Heights Community Center occupied a former manor house at the entrance to the development, its brick exterior and white columns lending an air of history and permanence to the relatively new neighborhood. Inside, the former ballroom had been converted to a multi-purpose space where HOA meetings, community events, and private functions were held throughout the year. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, dressed in business casual attire straight from the office, charcoal slacks, light blue button-down, no tie. He chose a seat near the back of the room, open laptop ready to take notes as other residents trickled in. He recognized some faces from his walks around the neighborhood: the woman with the stroller who had quickened her pace, an older gentleman who meticulously tended his roses each morning, a young couple who had waved from their driveway once but never introduced themselves. James arrived and took the seat beside Marcus, offering a supportive nod. "Ever been to one of these?" James whispered. "Not here," Marcus replied, "but I've attended a few in my previous neighborhood." "Brace yourself," James warned. "Diane runs these like parliamentary sessions, complete with Robert's rules and all the formality she can muster." Right on cue, Diane entered from a side door, followed by 4 other board members. Sandra from the Beautification Committee, an elderly man Marcus didn't recognize, a middle-aged woman with a severe bob haircut, and a younger man who appeared to be checking his watch repeatedly. "That's Howard Gaines, the president," James whispered, indicating the elderly man. "Mostly a figurehead. Patricia Williams is secretary, very much in Diane's camp. And that's Michael Chen, vice president. Decent guy but busy with his medical practice. Rarely opposes anything just to get the meetings over with." Diane noticed Marcus immediately, her eyes narrowing slightly before she composed herself and took her place at the board table. She whispered something to Howard, who glanced in Marcus's direction with undisguised curiosity. At precisely 7 p.m., Howard called the meeting to order, leading them through approval of previous minutes and a treasurer's report delivered by Diane with meticulous attention to detail. Marcus listened attentively, noting the significant HOA reserves and the emphasis placed on covenant enforcement in the budget allocations. The meeting proceeded to committee reports and old business, most of which involved mundane matters of landscaping contracts and plans for the community pool opening. New business included a vote on updated parking regulations for visitors, passed unanimously, and a discussion about replacing playground equipment. Throughout, Marcus observed the dynamics of the board and the audience. About 20 residents had attended, most sitting passively as the board made decisions. Occasionally, someone would raise a question, always acknowledged by Howard but typically addressed by Diane, whose encyclopedic knowledge of the covenant allowed her to cite specific sections from memory. "Any other new business?" Howard asked as the meeting neared its scheduled end time. Marcus raised his hand. Howard hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, the gentleman in the back. Marcus Johnson, 1422. Sycamore Lane," Marcus said, standing as all eyes turned toward him. "I'm curious about the process for addressing potential inconsistencies in covenant enforcement." A murmur rippled through the room. Diane's posture stiffened. "Could you elaborate?" Howard asked, looking unsure. "Certainly," Marcus replied. "I've noticed what appears to be selective enforcement of certain covenant provisions. I'm wondering if there's a formal process for reviewing enforcement actions to ensure they're being applied equitably across all residents." Patricia, the secretary, leaned toward her microphone. "The Compliance Committee conducts regular neighborhood inspections and responds to reported violations. All homeowners are subject to the same standards. With all due respect," Marcus continued, his tone professional but firm, "that doesn't address my question about reviewing enforcement patterns. For example, I received a violation notice for placing trash bins out 12 hours and 10 minutes before collection, but I've observed multiple properties on Maple Drive with bins out a full day early without apparent consequence." The room went silent. Diane cleared her throat. "Mr. Johnson, if you have specific concerns about your property, we have a process for that. This isn't the appropriate forum for individual complaints." "I'm not raising an individual complaint," Marcus clarified. "I'm inquiring about the governance process for ensuring fair and consistent application of the covenant across all properties, regardless of who owns them." Michael Chen, the vice president, checked his watch again before speaking. "That's actually a reasonable question. Perhaps the Compliance Committee could prepare a report on enforcement actions for the past quarter, categorized by violation type and location. That would give us data to assess whether there are any unintentional patterns emerging." Diane shot Michael a look that could have wilted his carefully trimmed hedge. "That would require significant administrative work, and I'm not sure what purpose it would serve beyond what we already track." "Transparency," Marcus said simply. "It would serve the purpose of transparency." Several heads nodded around the room. James suppressed a smile beside him. Howard, clearly sensing the shift in the room's energy, cleared his throat. "Perhaps we could add this to next month's agenda for further discussion? In the meantime, Mr. Johnson, if you'd like to submit your suggestion in writing to the board, we can give it proper consideration." "I'd be happy to," Marcus replied. "Thank you for your time." As the meeting adjourned, Marcus felt the weight of stares, some curious, some approving, some decidedly hostile. Diane gathered her papers with sharp, angry movements, deliberately avoiding eye contact as Marcus and James made their way to the exit. Outside in the warm evening air, James shook his head in amazement. "That was masterful. You basically called them out on their discrimination without ever saying the word." "I didn't come here looking for a fight," Marcus said quietly. "But I'm not going to pretend I don't see what's happening either." "Well, you've definitely made an impression," James replied. "For better or worse, you're on everyone's radar now." As if to confirm his words, Marcus's phone pinged with an email notification as they reached his car. From HOA Compliance Committee Compliance, oakwoodheightshoa.org, to Marcus Johnson, marcus.johnson@email.com. Subject: Violation Notice, Unauthorized Landscape Modification. Dear Mr. Johnson, this notice is to inform you that your property at 1422 Sycamore Lane is currently in violation of the Oakwood Heights HOA Covenant, Section 10.4.2, regarding unauthorized irrigation systems. All permanent or semi-permanent irrigation systems require prior written approval. Please remove the unauthorized system within 72 hours or submit a retroactive application for approval with $150 processing fee. Failure to comply may result in fines of $25 per day until the violation is remedied. Sincerely, Oakwood Heights HOA Compliance Committee Marcus, showed the email to James, who whistled low. That was fast. She's not even trying to hide it now. Perfect, Marcus said, a small smile playing at his lips as he added the new violation to his spreadsheet. The more blatant, the better. What's your next move? James asked. Marcus considered the question as he unlocked his car. I think it's time to review the Fair Housing Act and state anti-discrimination statutes. And maybe set up some security. Cameras. Going lawyer mode, huh? Just covering my bases, Marcus replied. Diane Keller has no idea who she's dealing with. As he drove home, Marcus reflected on the escalating situation. He hadn't come to Oakwood Heights seeking conflict, but neither would he back down from this challenge. Sometimes the most important battles found you rather than the other way around. Tomorrow he would begin the next phase of his strategy, not just documentation, but preparation for the formal complaint that would inevitably be necessary, and, if Diane wanted to continue her campaign of harassment, she would soon discover that Marcus Johnson was not someone who could be easily intimidated or outmaneuvered. The game was changing, and so were the stakes. The first week of June brought unseasonable heat to Northern Virginia, the kind of sticky, oppressive warmth that made even morning walks uncomfortable and sent air conditioning units into constant hum throughout Oakwood Heights. Marcus had adapted his routine accordingly, earlier morning runs watering his garden at dawn before the sun could evaporate the moisture, keeping blinds drawn on the south-facing windows during peak daylight hours. His professional life had intensified as well. Oracle was preparing for a major security protocol update, which meant longer hours hunched over his keyboard, more frequent meetings with the development team, and increasing pressure to meet ambitious deadlines. Marcus thrived under such conditions, his mind clearest when faced with complex problems requiring elegant solutions. This morning, however, his focus was split between work and home concerns. The past 2 weeks had seen a noticeable escalation in Diane's campaign against him. After the HOA meeting where he had raised questions about selective enforcement, the violation notices had increased in both frequency and absurdity. Violation: decorative stones in garden beds exceed maximum permitted size, 2 diameter. Violation: hose not fully retracted into hose reel when not in use. Violation: unauthorized tree pruning without arborist consultation. Violation: exterior lighting exceeds permitted lumens. Each complaint had been documented in Marcus's now extensive spreadsheet, along with photographic evidence of his compliance with the covenant and, more tellingly, examples of other properties with identical features that had received no citations. He had responded to each notice with professional courtesy, providing specific covenant sections that proved his compliance, requesting clarification where the rules seemed ambiguous, and maintaining a tone of reasonable cooperation. The difference was that now, he was also gathering evidence of discrimination. The security cameras installed discreetly around his property had captured Diane photographing his house on multiple occasions, lingering pointedly while observing his garden, and even once approaching his mailbox before apparently thinking better of whatever she had intended. More importantly, Marcus had been methodically building relationships within the neighborhood. Weekend walks with strategic stops to compliment gardens or admire home improvements had yielded several friendly acquaintances. His excellent memory for names and details served him well, allowing him to ask after family members or follow up on previously mentioned events. "These roses are spectacular, Mrs. Abernathy," he would say to the elderly woman on the corner. "Did your granddaughter's recital go well last weekend?" Such interactions gradually softened the initial wariness he had encountered. Not everyone warmed to him. Some residents maintained their distance, and a few, clearly in Diane's circle, remained overtly cool. But many responded to his genuine interest and unfailing politeness with growing acceptance. Through these connections, Marcus had gathered more information about previous residents who had faced similar treatment. The Washingtons weren't the only family to have been essentially hounded out of Oakwood Heights. There had been the Gonzaleses 3 years prior, and before them the Chens, no relation to Michael on the board, who had sold their home after just 9 months of residency. A pattern was undeniably emerging, one that Marcus documented with the Same precision he applied to his own experiences. This morning he sat at his kitchen island, reviewing his case notes while sipping coffee before heading to the office. The formal complaint he was preparing for the HOA board was nearly complete. 27 pages of meticulously organized evidence, covenant citations, comparative enforcement examples, and a clear timeline of escalating harassment. His phone buzzed with a text from James. Heads up. Emergency HOA meeting called for tomorrow night. Agenda vague but mentions compliance issues requiring immediate attention. My guess, it's about you. Marcus frowned, typing back. Thanks for the warning. I'll be there. This was unexpected. Emergency. Meetings were rare according to the HOA bylaws, reserved for urgent matters affecting community safety or property values. What could Diane possibly have manufactured to justify such a dramatic step? He glanced out his kitchen window toward Diane's house, noticing unusual activity. A county vehicle was parked in her driveway, a man in uniform speaking with her on the front porch. Marcus couldn't make out details, but the official nature of the visit piqued his interest. His doorbell rang 20 minutes later, just as he was preparing to leave for work. On his porch stood a middle-aged man wearing a county government polo shirt and carrying a clipboard. Mr. Johnson? I'm Robert Alvarez, Code Enforcement Officer for Fairfax County. I need to speak with you about a reported violation. Marcus maintained his composure, though his mind raced. Of course, what seems to be the issue? We received a complaint about unauthorized structural modifications to your property, Alvarez explained, consulting his clipboard. Specifically, an irrigation system installed without proper permits and potentially violating county water usage regulations. Understanding dawned immediately. Diane had escalated beyond the HOA, involving county officials in her campaign. It was both petty and desperate, and potentially dangerous for her if the complaint proved frivolous. I'd be happy to show you the system in question, Marcus said, leading the officer to his backyard. It's a temporary above-ground drip irrigation, set up for my vegetable garden. No structural modifications were made. Alvarez examined the simple arrangement of tubing and emitters, clearly visible atop the soil and connected to a standard garden hose spigot via a timer device. He made notes, took several photos, and measured the total area of the garden. This definitely doesn't require county permits, he confirmed after his inspection. It's basically a glorified hose, not a permanent irrigation system. Whoever filed this complaint was misinformed. Marcus nodded. May I ask who filed the complaint? County policy prevents me from disclosing that information, Alvarez replied, though his quick glance toward Diane's property spoke volumes. But I would suggest that if you're having disputes with your HOA, try to resolve them internally before they escalate to county level. We've got actual code violations to deal with. I understand completely, Marcus said. I apologize for the wasted trip. Not your fault, Alvarez said, handing Marcus a form. This is official documentation that no violation was found. Keep it for your records. After the officer left, Marcus added the incident to his documentation, scanning the county form as additional evidence. He would be late for work now, but this development was too significant to ignore. His phone rang as he was finally getting into his car. The screen displayed Oracle HR. Marcus Johnson speaking, he answered, wondering what human resources could want at this hour. Marcus, this is Veronica from HR. I'm calling because we've received a rather unusual email that I wanted to discuss with you directly. What kind of email? Marcus asked, a knot forming in his stomach. Someone named Diane Keller sent a message to our general inquiries address, copying several executives. She's questioning your employment status and suggesting that you may have misrepresented your income to obtain financing for your home. The knot in Marcus's stomach tightened into cold anger. I see. To be perfectly clear, Veronica continued, we're not taking this seriously as an HR matter. Your employment and performance are exemplary. I'm calling as a courtesy because this seems potentially harassing, and I wanted to make you aware. I appreciate that, Marcus said, keeping his voice steady despite his growing rage. Could you forward me the email? Already done. And Marcus? If you're experiencing harassment, Oracle has resources that might help. Legal can provide guidance, if needed. Thank you, Veronica. That might be necessary. After ending the call, Marcus sat in his car for several minutes, processing this new development. Diane had crossed a line from petty HOA harassment to actively attempting to interfere with his livelihood. The strategy was as transparent as it was offensive. If she couldn't drive him out through covenant enforcement, perhaps attacking his professional reputation would succeed. She had severely miscalculated. Marcus opened his email on his phone, finding Veronica's forwarded message. Diane's email to Oracle was even worse than he had imagined, insinuating not only that he had misrepresented his income, but suggesting that his lifestyle raised questions about the source of his funds. The racial coding was barely concealed. A black man in an expensive house must be doing something illegal. It was the oldest and most tiresome of stereotypes, one Marcus had encountered before but never so blatantly weaponized against him. He forwarded the email to his personal account, adding it to his growing file of evidence. Then he made a decision. Reaching for his phone again, he scrolled to a contact he hadn't yet used. Rajiv, it's Marcus. Remember your cousin at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund? I think I'd like that introduction now. The Oakwood Heights Emergency HOA meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. the following evening. Marcus arrived at 6:45, dressed not in his usual business casual attire, but in a full suit, charcoal gray with subtle pinstripes, crisp white shirt, blue, silk tie. It was his court attire, rarely worn since he had transitioned from law to tech, but maintained for occasions that required a particular kind of authority. He was accompanied by Elaine Washington, a sharply dressed woman in her 40s, who carried a leather portfolio and observed the room with practiced assessment. They chose seats in the front row, a deliberate departure from Marcus's previous position at the back. The room filled quickly, attendance much higher than the regular meeting. Word had spread about the emergency session, curiosity drawing residents, who normally ignored HOA proceedings. Marcus acknowledged several neighbors with nods, including James, who entered with his wife, and gave Marcus a subtle thumbs up upon noticing his companion. At precisely 7 p.m., the board members entered. Howard, first, followed by Michael, Patricia, and Sandra. Diane came last, her usual confident stride faltering slightly when she noticed Marcus in the front row. Her eyes widened fractionally at his formal attire, then narrowed as she took in Elaine beside him. Howard called the meeting to order with visible discomfort, his usual perfunctory opening remarks rushed and stumbling. As you know, this emergency session was called to address urgent compliance issues affecting community standards. Our treasurer, Diane Keller, has prepared a presentation on these matters. Diane approached the podium, arranging her papers with hands that trembled almost imperceptibly. Thank you, Howard. As many of you know, the Oakwood Heights Covenant exists to protect our property values and ensure our community maintains the standards we all agreed to when purchasing our homes. She launched into a presentation about recent, concerning trends in covenant violations, displayed in a PowerPoint featuring photographs of supposed infractions. While no addresses were shown, the images were clearly of Marcus's property. His garden beds, his exterior lighting, his recently painted front door, approved Oakwood tan shade number 4 but apparently questionable in its application. When violations persist despite multiple notices, Diane continued, her voice gaining strength as she warmed to her subject, the board must consider more serious enforcement actions. Section 14.7 of our covenant allows for escalating fines, and in extreme cases, property liens for continued non-compliance. Marcus maintained his composure, his expression neutral as he made occasional notes on a legal pad. Beside him, Elaine did the same, her fountain pen moving in smooth, deliberate strokes. Therefore, Diane concluded, I propose the board authorize escalated enforcement actions against persistent violators, specifically authorizing daily fines of $100 for unresolved violations after the third notice and preparation of lien documents. After 30 days of non-payment, the room had grown tense, residents shifting uncomfortably as the targeted nature of the presentation became increasingly obvious. Howard cleared his throat. Thank you, Diane. Before we discuss this proposal, I should ask if there's any public comment. Marcus stood immediately, buttoning his suit jacket in a single fluid motion. "Yes, I'd like to speak." Howard nodded, visibly nervous. "Go ahead, Mr. Johnson." "Thank you." Marcus approached the podium as Diane reluctantly vacated it, returning to her seat with visible reluctance. "For those who don't know me, I'm Marcus Johnson, resident at 1422 Sycamore Lane." His voice carried clearly throughout the room, the practiced cadence of someone comfortable with public speaking. "I moved to Oakwood Heights just over 2 months ago, drawn by the beautiful homes, excellent schools, and strong sense of community." He paused, making eye contact with various residents around the room. "In those 2 months, I've received 17 violation notices for my property, an average of 2 per week. Each has been addressed or contested with specific reference to covenant guidelines. Each has been documented extensively." Marcus opened a folder he had brought to the podium, removing several photographs. "These are images of properties throughout Oakwood Heights taken yesterday, showing identical conditions to those for which I received violations." He placed them on the display table, clearly visible to the board and front rows. "Different properties, same conditions, no violations issued." Murmurs spread through the audience. Marcus continued, his tone remaining professional but firm. "I've also experienced escalating harassment beyond covenant enforcement, including a frivolous county code violation report that wasted taxpayer resources, and most disturbingly, direct interference with my employment through false allegations sent to my employer." Gasps and whispers rippled through the crowd. Diane's face had gone pale. "I believe these actions constitute a clear pattern of discriminatory harassment in violation of the Fair Housing Act, Virginia housing discrimination law, and potentially several federal civil rights statutes." He gestured toward Elaine. "This is Elaine Washington, attorney with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. She's here as my legal counsel and to observe these proceedings as we prepare a formal discrimination complaint." The room erupted in shocked conversation. Howard banged his gavel ineffectively, trying to restore order. "Mr. Johnson, this is highly irregular," he began. "With respect, Mr. Gaines," Marcus interrupted, "what's irregular is the systematic targeting of minority homeowners in this community through selective covenant enforcement. The Washingtons, the Gonzaleses, the Chens, and now me, the pattern is clear and documented." He returned to his seat as chaos continued to swirl through the room. Residents turned to one another in hushed conversations, many looking shocked, some nodding in agreement, others appearing defensive. Michael Chen leaned forward to his microphone. "I move we table the proposed enforcement escalation, pending a full review of enforcement actions over the past 2 years, with demographic analysis to ensure equitable application of our covenant." "Second," called a voice from the audience. James, standing with his hand raised. Howard, clearly overwhelmed by the rapid shift in momentum, looked helplessly toward Diane, who sat rigid with fury, staring directly at Marcus. "All in favor?" Howard asked weakly. Hands rose throughout the room, not just residents but board members as well. Only Diane, Patricia, and a small cluster of older residents in the back row kept their hands down. "Motion carries," Howard declared. "The proposal is tabled pending review." As the meeting descended into animated discussion groups, Marcus remained seated, maintaining his professional demeanor despite the victory. Elaine leaned over, speaking softly. "Impressive performance, you've clearly rattled them." "This isn't about performance," Marcus replied quietly. "It's about accountability." Across the room, Diane stood abruptly and left through a side door, ignoring questions called after her by confused allies. Her hasty departure only added to the sense that something significant had shifted in the power dynamic of Oakwood Heights. The remainder of the meeting passed in a blur of procedural matters handled by Howard with distracted efficiency. When it finally adjourned, Marcus found himself surrounded by residents, some offering support, others curious about his allegations, a few expressing skepticism but willing to hear more. "The Washingtons were friends of ours," an older woman told him, squeezing his arm. "What happened to them was shameful. It's about time someone spoke up." "Is it true she contacted your employer?" asked another neighbor, shock evident in his voice. Marcus answered questions calmly. neither inflaming the situation nor backing down from his assertions. When he finally exited the community center nearly an hour later, night had fallen completely, a crescent moon hanging low over the tree line. James caught up with him in the parking lot. "That was something else. You okay?" "I'm fine," Marcus assured him. "Though I doubt Diane is." "What happens now?" James asked. "Now we see if the board does the right thing with their review," Marcus replied. "If not, the formal complaint proceeds, and this becomes a much larger issue for Oakwood Heights." "You think she'll back down?" Marcus considered the question as they reached his car. People like Diane rarely back down voluntarily, but they often overreach when cornered, which works in our favor. "Well, you've got allies now," James said, gesturing toward the community center where residents still lingered, discussing the evening's dramatic events. "More than you might have realized." "That's how change happens," Marcus replied. "Not all at once, but person by person, conversation by conversation." They parted with a handshake, James heading back to his wife while Marcus slid into his car. As he drove home, he felt not triumph but resolution, a complex mixture of determination, justified anger, and cautious hope that something meaningful might emerge from this conflict. When he turned onto Sycamore Lane, he immediately noticed the patrol car parked near his driveway, its lights flashing silently in the darkness. Marcus pulled his car alongside the curb, several houses away from his own driveway, and observed the scene. The patrol car's lights cast alternating blue and red patterns across the manicured lawns and brick facades of Sycamore Lane. Two officers stood on his front porch, one knocking firmly on his door while the other surveyed the property with a flashlight. Several neighbors had emerged from their homes, watching from a cautious distance. He considered his options carefully. Whatever was happening, it was clearly Diane's response to the HOA meeting. Too immediate to be coincidence. Too calculated to be routine. His years in law school and brief time practicing before his career change had taught him that police encounters required clear-headed caution, particularly for someone who looked like him. Taking a deep breath, Marcus straightened his tie, exited his car, and walked with deliberate calm toward his home, maintaining a relaxed but dignified posture. As he approached, the officers turned toward him, hands instinctively moving to rest near their service weapons, not drawing them, but establishing quick access if needed. The gesture, likely unconscious on their part, was one Marcus had experienced before. "Good evening, officers," he called from a reasonable distance, keeping his hands visible at his sides. "I'm Marcus Johnson. This is my home. Can I help you with something?" The older of the two officers, a heavy-set man with graying hair at his temples, stepped forward. "Mr. Johnson, I'm Officer Daniels with Fairfax County Police. We received a report of suspicious activity at this address." "Suspicious activity?" Marcus repeated, maintaining his composure despite the familiar scenario unfolding. "What kind of suspicious activity?" "The caller reported an unknown individual attempting to enter the residence," the second officer explained, younger and visibly uncomfortable. Since the homeowner was reportedly at a community meeting, they were concerned about a potential break-in. Marcus nodded slowly, understanding perfectly. "I see. Well, as you can see, I am the homeowner. I've just come from that community meeting. Perhaps there was some confusion." He reached carefully into his inner jacket pocket, telegraphing his movements deliberately. "I have my identification and proof of residence if that would be helpful." Officer Daniels examined Marcus's driver's license and a recent piece of mail, comparing the address to the house number. "Everything appears to be in order, Mr. Johnson. Sorry for the disturbance. We have to respond to all calls, you understand?" "Of course," Marcus replied. "I appreciate you doing your job. May I ask who called in this report?" The officers exchanged glances. "We're not at liberty to share that information," the younger officer said, though his eyes briefly flickered toward Diane's house. "Understood," Marcus said. "Is there anything else you need from me?" "No, sir," Officer Daniels replied. "Again, sorry for the confusion. You have a good night." As the officers returned to their patrol car, Marcus noticed several neighbors still watching from their driveways and porches. James and his wife had arrived home and stood nearby, concern evident. on their faces. Marcus gave them a reassuring nod before turning his attention to a figure partially concealed behind a large oak tree, several houses down. Diane, phone in hand, observing the scene from a distance. Their eyes met briefly across the darkened street. Marcus maintained the contact steadily until Diane turned and walked briskly back toward her home. Only then did Marcus enter his house, closing the door behind him and finally allowing his carefully maintained composure to slip. He loosened his tie, his hands trembling slightly with the controlled anger he had suppressed throughout the encounter. This, calling the police with a false report, was more than harassment. It was potentially dangerous, a malicious escalation that could have ended very differently under other circumstances. His doorbell rang, startling him. Through the peephole, he saw James and several other neighbors standing on his porch. He opened the door cautiously. "You okay?" James asked immediately. "We saw the police." "I'm fine," Marcus assured them. "Just another harassment tactic." "She called the police on you?" asked a woman Marcus recognized from down the street. Caroline, if he remembered correctly. "That's completely out of line." "We saw what happened at the meeting," added an older man who introduced himself as Bernard, a resident of 15 years. "I've never spoken out before, but this has gone too far. Several of us wanted to check on you." Marcus was momentarily taken aback by the unexpected show of support. "I appreciate that. Would you like to come in?" The impromptu gathering moved to Marcus's living room, where 6 neighbors, James and his wife Sarah, Caroline and her husband Robert, Bernard, and a younger woman named Aisha, who lived in the corner house, settled onto couches and chairs. The conversation flowed with surprising ease, initial awkwardness giving way to genuine concern and shared frustration. "Diane's been running this neighborhood like her personal fiefdom for years," Bernard explained, accepting a glass of water from Marcus. "Many of us have just tried to stay out of her way. She cited us 3 times when we first moved in," Caroline added. "Our mailbox was apparently 2 inches too tall. After the 3rd notice, we just replaced it to keep the peace. But calling the police with a false report," Sarah said, shaking her head, "that crosses a line from annoying to dangerous." "It's also potentially criminal," Marcus noted, his legal training surfacing. "Filing a false police report is not just an HOA matter." The conversation continued for nearly an hour, neighbors sharing their own experiences with Diane's tactics and expressing growing concern about the pattern that Marcus had identified at the meeting. What emerged was a clearer picture of a community held hostage by fear of conflict and property value impacts, where casual racism had been tolerated under the guise of standards and community character. "What are you going to do now?" Aisha asked as the gathering began to wind down. Marcus considered the question carefully. "Continue building my case, document everything, and see how the board responds to tonight's meeting. But I won't be intimidated. Out of my home." As his neighbors departed with promises of support and exchanged phone numbers, Marcus felt a subtle shift in his perspective. What had begun as a personal battle against discrimination had evolved into something larger, a community reckoning with its own complicity and an opportunity for meaningful change. Later that night, after changing into more comfortable clothes and reviewing his notes from the meeting, Marcus's phone rang. The screen displayed a number he didn't recognize. "Hello? Mr. Johnson? This is Michael Chen from the HOA board. I hope it's not too late to call." Marcus checked the time. 10:22 p.m. "Not at all. What can I do for you, Dr. Chen?" "I wanted to apologize for what happened tonight," Michael said, his voice low as if concerned about being overheard, both at the meeting and afterward. "I've just heard about the police incident from another board member who lives on your street." "I appreciate that," Marcus replied, surprised by the outreach. "I also wanted you to know that I've called an executive session of the board for tomorrow morning," Michael continued. "Without Diane present, there are concerns among some board members about potential liability for the HOA if your discrimination claims proceed to formal legal action." "That's understandable," Marcus said carefully. "The evidence is substantial." "Yes, well," Michael hesitated. I'm not supposed to tell you this, but I think you should be prepared. Howard is considering asking for Diane's resignation as treasurer. This was unexpected, faster movement than Marcus had anticipated. That's a significant step. It's primarily self-preservation, Michael admitted. None of us want to be named in a federal housing discrimination lawsuit, but frankly, many of us are also genuinely disturbed by the pattern you've identified. I've lived here 6 years and never connected the dots until you laid it out so clearly tonight.